This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, a special episode recorded on March 28th, 2020. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today, the John Snow Professor and Director of the Center for Infection and Immunity at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health, Ian Lipkin. Welcome back.
Thank you. You used to say the type that make you sick, and I can testify that that is indeed the case.
Is this
and there's the evidence.
Is this your first emerging infection, Ian?
I guess it is. In 2003, when I came back from China, I probably was infected with an unusual strain of influenza virus. It was not SARS at that time. This time, I've been infected with a genuine article.
Yeah, so you have an infection with SARS-CoV-2, so you have COVID-19 disease, and let's chat about it. So first of all, how are you feeling? Are you well?
I am not well, but I am definitely better. And it's such a pleasure to be to talk with somebody who actually describes it properly, because every time I go on any sort of media, they say, "Oh, you've been infected with COVID-19." And I try to explain to them that there's the disease and the virus and that they're different.
Right.
So yes, I'm infected with SARS-CoV-2.
I should leave the coughing in the recording, right? It will give a little verite to our conversation.
Absolutely.
So tell us the clinical course. What first clued you in that you might have some sort of infection?
So I had a mild upper respiratory tract infection for about a week, but really I think was something very different because my wife had it as well. And then on Friday, a week ago, I began feeling a bit different. So I had myalgias, and I woke up very early on a Saturday morning, so that's literally a week ago, with a very painful headache. Literally woke me from sleep at about 2:00, and I couldn't shake it for several hours, and I had it for 2-3 days thereafter. And that's when I said, this is not what I had before. This is unusual. And I had some night sweats, and I went in and had myself tested by one of our faculty members. I couldn't go into the lab. That obviously was not a good idea. What I did is I drove about a block away, where we have this blockade now on Haven Avenue. Mm-hmm. And Nisha Mishra came out, and I swabbed myself, gave him the swab, and he called me back about 3 or 4 hours later and said, "You got a very high titer, Ian." Came up at 20 cycles.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Did he do a proper nasopharyngeal or just a nares swab?
Well, he didn't do it. I did it. So what I did was that I started by swabbing the back of my throat until I gagged, mm-hmm. so that I got a very deep, a deep sample. And then I went into the nares as well, as far back as I could without hitting cortex, broke it out, took it out, broke it into a tube, and then he ran it from there. So. Mm-hmm.
So then, after that, how did the infection progress? Did it move deeper into your lungs?
I started developing a persistent cough. It's described as a non-productive cough, but I would say it's a minimally productive cough. Periodically, you do bring up something, but it doesn't look like a bacterial infection. Mm-hmm. And it is really, it's quite, it's difficult. You can cough sometimes till your ribs hurt. Mm-hmm. So I've had that for about a week. And 4 days ago, I was offered an opportunity by my colleagues in China to get plasma therapy. So Chen Zhu had I'd reviewed this paper he'd submitted to PNAS. I'd been impressed with the data. I'd shared it with various people. And he said, "Look, I'll send you some plasma. I'm A+. He was going to say A positive. He was going to send me the plasma. I couldn't get anyone to infuse it. He was also going to send me some antibodies against Title VI. So I spoke with the ID people at Columbia, and they said, we don't think you should do this. We'll just do the hydroxychloroquine. So I started that. I have no idea whether or not the hydroxychloroquine made any difference in terms of the virus, but I can tell you that the loading dose, which was 800 milligrams, certainly does make you lightheaded.
Mm-hmm. The new paper just came out today from the Marseille group with an expanded cohort of patients that they treated, and there's a pretty impressive decrease in viral load.
Yeah. Some of us feel the jury's still out on that.
Yeah. You didn't take azithromycin as well, did you?
I did not.
So we have no idea if it worked. Have you been has your condition improved since you started taking it?
It did not improve for the first 3 days. It improved this morning. But given that I'm probably 9 to 10 days out, I can't tell you that it was, the hydroxychloroquine. It may well have just been the natural course.
Sure.
And if you listen to what Tony Fauci has to say, and I agree with him, we need better trials. But, I'm just happy to be on the mend.
Do you have any, or did you at any time have any gastrointestinal symptoms?
I did. I had, the first day I took this hydroxychloroquine, within about an hour, I had explosive diarrhea. I don't know that has anything to do with the hydroxychloroquine. It may well have been something associated with with COVID or something unrelated. But I can tell you that the coughing keeps you up and it's tough. And I can see how someone who's older and has some sort of comorbidities who couldn't clear their throats might in fact have a fatal outcome.
Yeah.
This is a tough one, very tough one.
You called it rugged the other day.
I'd say that, well, I call it rugged. It's still rugged. This is something to avoid. I mean, the irony is I went to China and everybody wears masks and gloves there. No problems. I come back. I'm put into confinement for 2 weeks. I come out of confinement. I'm doing media, traveling around the city. Most of the time, I'm very cautious. But when you start doing media, it's very difficult because you've got people who are, they're doing makeup, they're doing hair, they're putting microphones and other things in front of you. There's a lot of community contact. And I presume this is how I became ill.
Yeah, yeah. At any point, have you had difficulty breathing?
I did. 2 days ago, I had shortness of breath. And today I went for a walk. I hiked about 1.5 miles. And coming back uphill with a very, very mild grade, I started getting shortness of breath. So it's tough. I'm 67. You're just a little younger than I am. I can tell you that it does make a difference. People I've spoken to who are younger weather this better than we do.
You think there are actually asymptomatic infections in younger people?
I know there are asymptomatic infections in younger people because we've seen some of these people who have no recollection of being ill whatsoever.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you can't differentiate the mild infection. This time of year, people may think that they have an allergy and they don't become febrile. And as a result, they shrug it off and pass it on. I think that we talk a lot about the R naught for this particular virus being in the range of 2 to 3. I think that that's an underestimate. And the reason I say that is typically when we're thinking in terms of these kinds of transmission events, we think in terms of transmission from person to person, but it's not really from person to person. It's person to subway pole or banister or doorknob. Right. So it's very difficult until we do the final analysis serologically and figure out how many people have been infected. We're not really going to understand, what the R naught is and what the case mortality rate is. It's probably going to be much, much lower than we realize. But if you think that, I don't know, it wouldn't surprise me if half the world's population became infected. That's still a large number of people.
So you mentioned serology. Where are we in being able to do serological tests?
There are many groups now that have reported various serological tests. If all you're looking for is exposure to this virus, there are commercial assays that are available now that I think can give you that kind of information. We're now moving into the phase of the disease where we're trying to identify individuals with neutralizing antibodies so that we can start using plasma therapy, something I'd like to talk about as we go through the hour. There are a number of surrogates that have been proposed. I still feel strongly that we need to be sure with bona fide neutralization tests that we're neutralizing virus. And, that's unfortunately work that requires a BSL-3.
Are you doing that in your lab? Because I know you have a BSL-3.
Yeah, we are doing that sort of work. Thomas Breeze, who you know is, and one of our techs has been growing virus. We got virus from Vincent Munster at RML, and that's the stock that we're using. He's been growing virus up for a little while now. He doesn't really see much in the way of CPE. So we may wind up using focus assays with fluorescence. We'll have to see. It's still early days for that.
I understand the virus grows very well in cell culture.
Extremely well. This is a hardy virus, and it grows very well in Ian Lipkin apparently. So we can culture me. I can produce large amounts of virus. Anyway, it's it reminds me of, when I used to work at Scripps with mice and we'd have an MHV infection in the colony because Mike Bookmeyer in those days was doing a lot of MHV work. It was once that MHV started spreading through a colony, it was impossible to clean that colony. You had to just shut down the facility.
Yeah.
Wasn't there an MHV infection at Columbia?
Yeah, there was.
A big one, I think.
In the mouse colony, for sure. It was a big problem, and I think part of the issue is that wild mice were getting in, and they had to rebuild the facility, essentially, to take care of that. Yeah, it's quite a big problem in a mouse colony.
Yeah, well, it's a big problem in a human colony, too.
So you said you thought half the population would ultimately be infected. Do you think that would be enough to impede transmission?
Well, I would impede transmission. I don't think it would prevent transmission. And I would hope that half the world's population does become infected. But I'm looking at the sort of response we have here in the United States. And, I'm concerned that we're not taking this with sufficient, seriousness to avert this sort of an outcome. I mean, when I came back from China, which was on the 4th of February, and I tried to convey my concerns, people didn't really take it as seriously as they should have done. And, as you know, this may not be the big pandemic that we're all most worried about. This is a pandemic for sure. But, it may not be as pathogenic as what could come down the line. So I hope that we learn from this.
Well, that's a good point. Do you think we should have been better prepared for this pandemic?
So let's consider how this country, the United States, which is obviously the one we know most, and I know a little bit about the response rate in China and in Australia, because I was involved with some of those efforts too. What happened after 9/11? So the whole concern about One Health, really reached, I think, public consciousness and political awareness with West Nile virus, because there were these independent lines investigating human and animal infection that only came together toward the end of the outbreak in New York. Despite the fact that everyone knew in this field that this was a problem, but the people who make decisions, the thought leaders, and major world capitals didn't really appreciate this. This has changed now, of course. And after 9/11, there was this big push to build biodefense centers. Those biodefense centers were funded for 11 years. They were then shut down because there was a perception that they weren't really needed anymore. there was one in Australia called the Australian Biosecurity Cooperative Research Center that was funded for 6 years before it was shut down. The Europeans, I think, have been better about maintaining their biosecurity efforts, biodefense efforts, than we have in some other parts of the world. And of course, after 2003, the Chinese dramatically ramped up, what their infrastructure looks like. So they built the Institute Pasteur to Shanghai. They built the Guangzhou Institute of Biomedicine and Health. They built programs in Beijing. They put together a large new CDC complex. And so they were actually better prepared, I think, than we were. The NIH has obviously got, strength, and the Department of Defense, except that, as you know, USAMRIID is in trouble. But there has been a sort of a dampening of the investment, I think, in emerging infectious diseases, at least under the current administration. And so we were not as prepared as we should have been. And the other thing, of course, is we were reluctant to accept the fact that the Chinese had actually done a good job of controlling the outbreak in Hubei province by being very aggressive with isolation, stratification of isolation, and in ramping up their research efforts in a concerted way. We didn't do that, and we had the advantage of time and insights, because the first sequences were released on the 10th of January by Eddie Holmes and colleagues out of Shanghai. We're slow out the gate. So here we are, March 28th, and we knew about this earlier. I first heard about this outbreak on the 15th of December from Ludahai Lu, who's a professor at Sun Yat-sen University, who runs a large One Health program there. We have a program with Professor Lu. It's been funded for about 6 months by the Chinese government, but doesn't really have any support in the U.S. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that program, because I think it's something that many people might want to join and participate in, because it has there's a lot of room for collaboration. It's called Gideon. It's this global infectious disease epidemiology network. So in the context of that network, I heard from Professor Lu. I then wrote to my, other colleagues nationally in China to ask about this outbreak in Wuhan. And finally, on the 31st, I heard that they'd identified this coronavirus, and I tried to push for release of sequences, but they really didn't come out until about a week and a half later. And that's really when I decided I needed to go to China to see for myself what was, what the issues were and so on. So I went to Guangzhou, met with Lu, met with officials from Guangzhou, Guangdong CDC. Then I went to Beijing and met the former Minister of Health, Chen Zhu, and Minister of Science and Technology, Xu Guanghua. I met with the premier, and we reviewed all their plans for control. And I saw Zhang Nangshen when I was still in Guangzhou, and he's a remarkable guy. He's 86 years old. Came out of retirement to take the reins and deal with the outbreak. Very, very interesting guy. Very successful, I think, in doing what he does. And they were they were transparent in sharing, that this was a serious threat, globally. Mm-hmm. And they've managed to curtail spread of the virus. And we should have followed their lead, and we still can. But, we're not doing that as yet, right?
Apparently not. When you came back from that trip, for example, did you talk to Tony Fauci and tell him what was going on and what you?
I've talked to lots of people, and I started going on to the news media and sharing as much as I could on the news media, because it's quite clear to me that although you and I may, have a lot of respect for, our representatives at NIAID and CDC and elsewhere, That's not a view that's universally held.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to push wherever you can. So you can push with CNN and NBC, but that's not really where you need to push.
Mm-hmm.
You need to go on to Oz and talk to people who reach the entire country.
Yeah.
So there's a large audience for us. We got over 300 million people to reach.
Yeah. So if we could have done something back in January, what should we have been doing as a country? What kind of efforts?
What really makes the difference, as far as we know at present, is isolation and testing. The testing is very helpful in guiding the way in which you isolate people. So knowing as you do, because you worked in viruses, and those of us who've worked with highly transmissible viruses understand that they're different. I mean, HIV is not like this. This is more infectious than flu. It's more infectious. I have discussions with Larry Breen about this. He says, well, it's not smallpox, it's not measles. And I say, I'm not sure. I don't think we can say that. I think this is the most transmissible virus I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And I make the allusion again to the way MHV spreads through a mouse colony. It's everywhere, and it's almost impossible to eradicate. And if you look at the data that came out of Vincent Munster's team, where he showed, the duration of viable virus on different surfaces, you can appreciate how easy it is to spread and how difficult it is to eradicate. So the isolation strategy that was initially undertaken was to say we're just gonna shut down this area so nothing goes any further. Mm-hmm. And that brought down the apparent R naught, to something like 1.3 or 1.4. What really made the difference was when they started looking within families and separating people who were already infected from people who might be infected. So further segregating them in that fashion, that they brought the R naught under 1. Mm-hmm. And that's what really turned the tide and allowed them to get moving forward. And now, of course, if I just had somebody who just came from Guangzhou, went through Beijing to come back to New York. There's a 2-week isolation period, a quarantine period for everybody coming into Beijing from any place else. So they feel like they've got everything there under control, and that's probably true. So anybody who has any sort of a suspicious respiratory tract infection, they're going to be all over it with diagnostic tests from something like 20 different companies and the ability to isolate and contain, which we don't do.
Why aren't we testing more? Why did it take so long for us to get to the point of being able to test more?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that contribute to that. One is the initial assays that were built, sadly, by some of our colleagues failed. And as a result, test kits had to be pulled back and they had to be reconfigured. Now I think they're excellent, but we had a period when we might have been able to test and we didn't. Furthermore, we had shortages of these tests and the equipment that's required to run these tests. Now, this is still a bit of a challenge because there are many places now where, there still isn't enough expertise, equipment, and supply to go around to manage this. Though it's, as I say, I think it's improving, it's increasingly, improving. Nonetheless, it remains a challenge. The more problematic issue, it seems to me, is that because we didn't jump on this quickly, it spun out of control. And it became multicentric. Mm. And this is, of course, not surprising to those of us who follow emerging infections. These do become multicentric very rapidly because there's no way to really, it's not as though we have borders around states. And it's ironic now, the notion that Mexico would seal off its border, with the U.S.
Yeah.
And, but there you have it. Strange things happen.
So the multicentric, is that what happened in Italy, for example, and it got out of control there?
Yes. And the other thing to remember about China is because as China's become a world power, and has moved into a wide range of different types of industries, they're no longer just providing goods. Mm-hmm. They are logging in Africa and mining in Africa and Central America. So you have roads that have been put in with people who are returning from vacation, and they carry this with them. I mean, this is not at all unusual. And then there was the timing, mm-hmm. With the new year and the celebrations and so on. And then you had all these conspiracy theories that, didn't help either. Mm-hmm. Remember the notion somehow that this was a deliberately manufactured biological weapon that was created in Wuhan Institute for Virology, which made no sense. I mean, on any of many levels. So in the first, of course, scientifically, if you look at the sequence, it's clear that that's not the case. But in addition, from a logical vantage point, why on earth would you produce something like that could attack your own citizens? This sort of foolishness also slowed us down and prevented what could have been more productive interactions.
Yeah. It's those rumors persist to this day, by the way. They won't die.
Yeah, I know it's a problem. And, they're typically put forward by the same people, every time we have discussions of this sort.
Yeah.
And they're not going to die because people are invested in them. This is like, what happens with the MMR vaccine and autism.
That's right.
There's, their rumors, they have their own life. Mm-hmm. I don't know how they're sustained, but they seem to be sustained. There doesn't seem to be any good way to choke them.
Yeah. I want to ask you about China. There's a lot of questioning about whether they do have it under control. To what extent should we listen to what they're telling the rest of the world? You know this best because you know them very well and you've been there many times.
I have so many close friends in China, who I care about, who care about me. And, when you break bread with somebody over a period of 17 years, it's very difficult for them to be disingenuous with you or vice versa. I'm confident that if I hear something from Chenzhou or Shuguanhua or, Zhongnan Chen or Gao Fu, mm-hmm. George mm-hmm. Gao, they're telling me what they know. It's always possible, and you will see, because there's going to be some stuff that's going to come out that's going to show, more insight into the origins of the outbreak. Some people are going to say this is evidence that they withheld information. And I'm going to push back and say, no, that's not the case. What this is like anything else. You build a model, you look at the data in light of the model. The data don't fit, right? Mm-hmm. You change the model. So they're continuously evaluating and reevaluating their response, their understanding of what transpired, where it came from, and so on. And nothing is going to change vis-a-vis an original bad origin, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's a bad origin, but I think the issues of, how it got to humans and when it got to humans, that may change. But that's no different than HIV, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we knew about HIV in the early 80s, but as we started doing serology in banks that had been collected earlier, we began to find evidence that the virus was circulating decades earlier. Yeah. So that's going to be the same thing here. And that happened with MERS, remember? So when we did our camel with MERS, we had access to a bank of camels here that went back 10 years. And we found that MERS had been, the MERS coronavirus had been in camels. for at least a decade. That was as far back as we could go.
Mm-hmm.
What we never really understand is why does it suddenly take off? That's a very interesting, a phenomenon that I don't really understand. I don't understand it with HIV. I think we understand it with West Nile. That was very different than with Zika, but not with some of these others.
Yeah. On that line, MERS has never really taken off in terms of sustained transmission. And we don't even understand that, right?
That's correct. And one of the reasons may be because, when we do see it, it is so much more pathogenic, right?
Yeah.
And that probably is, that's its lifestyle. It's, it's never really adapted to humans the way this one has. But I'm very concerned about two things right now. One is this idea that we hear from our leadership that Easter, we're going to, diminish the few constraints we have right now on virus replication.
Mm-hmm.
I think this would be a dramatic mistake, and we'll pay for it. I'm hoping that someone is able to persuade people to do things differently. I am concerned that we won't be successful in that effort.
Do you think we should continue the restrictions on movements and so forth for longer than that?
I think that we should take a page, from what the Chinese did. My view is that we should have and still should have a nationwide lockdown with stratified social distancing followed by extensive testing. And we should evaluate on a weekly basis whether, in fact, we're having an impact. I think that if, in fact, we did that, we would see a dramatic reduction in cases within 2 weeks. And if we continued it, for 2 weeks thereafter, we'd have the whole thing under control in 4 to 6 weeks. That requires that we do this in a rigorous fashion. If you do it in a half-hearted way, it's not going to have that impact. And I just don't see the appetite, for doing this, because people think somehow that they're going to get things under control. I'll give you an example. Within our own school, where we had a discussion yesterday and earlier, following up really on the discussion of face masks. Well, I had a conversation almost a month ago with Arnold Monto and Allison Ayello, who really experts on the whole topic of face masks and whether they are or not valuable. And back in 2003 in Beijing, there was a WHO investigation. It wasn't as large as some people would like to see a study, but you have to do these things opportunistically that show that face masks, whether surgical or N95, had a dramatic impact on community transmission. And it met one particular bar that I find particularly compelling. In epidemiological research, when you see something called a dose response, it becomes very compelling. So people who use face masks in a consistent way had a 70% reduction in community transmission. And if they used them intermittently, it was 60%. That was, I found that impressive, and we talked about it, but there was no access to face masks. And so I thought a long time about trying to publish this, because if we did that, it would have deprived, people on the front lines, because there weren't sufficient face masks, for getting access to those, and it would have made things worse. So I didn't proceed with that. So that's something that unfortunately is going to go in the memoirs rather than in the written record. But that was really why. And so there are these two very good modelers who are looking at what's happening in New York and what's happening nationally. And we looked at the data for New York. I asked them to look specifically at an Easter, moratorium on this, well, just sort of saying we're going to get out of the isolation in New York and the implications. And we looked at that, and it was a big spike, as you might anticipate, a couple to 4 weeks later. And I anticipate that we'll see the same thing nationally. But then one of these people who were doing the modeling said, but all we need to do is put people into face masks and everybody can go back to work tomorrow. I said, absolutely not. That's crazy. First of all, most people don't know how to use face masks, right? So, they fiddle with them. So they really sort of obviate the whole purpose. And secondly, we don't have any data to support that. All we know is that in conjunction, they're important. So we're still trying to do everything we can with education. Have you seen the Contagion clips yet? Do you know about those?
No, I've seen the movie, of course.
No. There's a new. So about 2 weeks ago, I got together with Scott Burns, the screenwriter, and we talked about whether or not the original cast of Contagion would be interested in doing some public service videos to teach people in the community how they should protect themselves, how they should protect one another, how they should protect the general community. And the idea was that they were going to reprise their original roles in talking about things that people need to do. So I want to make sure that I send you this link so that you can share it with your audience.
Yes.
And so you have Jennifer Ely, who talks about vaccines, and Kate Winslet talking about hand washing, and Matt Damon on social distancing, and Lawrence Fishburne talking about the way in which you can transmit virus through things like handshakes, and we're probably going to have two more. I'm not allowed to say that yet because the actors in the studio are not entirely happy with that. But now, but Scott wrote these. I read them. Steve Morris read them. We made sure that they were clear and accurate. The actors read their lines. They did their own filming, with iPhones, which was fun. And then Steven Soderbergh edited all of it and put in English, an English crawl below so that you get the information twice. And then somebody suggested we should translate it into Spanish, which is what we've done. So it's in at least two languages, and you can, I think you'll find it, first of all, it's nice to see them all. It's great that we have that kind of support, and, it's doing well. So Participant Media has supported this. I think Amazon is supporting it. There may be some support from other people as well, but the link is on the Mailman School of Public Health website. I think it's actually through CII, but I'll send you the link.
Yes.
And I think you'll enjoy seeing these guys talk about viruses.
I think that's a brilliant idea. I love it. I understand that the movie Contagion is getting a lot of viewing these days.
It is the number one download. So I unfortunately I don't have anything on the back end, which would be nice, but I'm happy it's doing well.
Can I ask you? You mentioned face masks in China. How extensive is face mask use? Is it just in Hubei, Wuhan, or is it everywhere?
Well, I saw it in Guangzhou and Beijing. And, I've seen pictures of it in Wuhan. I did not go to Wuhan. But people were taking this very seriously. And I think, as it gets warmer and people become, clear that this is not, a continued problem in China, they'll slowly come off. But everywhere I went in China, for the time I was there, people were wearing masks, except in their private offices. And I did interviews, in television studios with, wearing a mask. Yeah. Very different here.
How extensive was the lockdown? We heard about it in Hubei and other places, but was it the entire country? I mean, I heard that the rural areas had no restrictions. Is that true?
Well, I didn't travel through any of the rural areas, but I do know that when I was in Beijing, when we stayed in a hotel, obviously, and when you'd go downstairs, The restaurant was closed. It was a bar area where you could place orders. Everyone was wearing masks and gloves at that point.
Mm-hmm.
In the streets, if there was no one to be seen, really. The very few cars that you would see, people would be wearing masks and gloves. Policemen who might be handling traffic would be wearing masks and gloves. So it was consistent, at least in Beijing and Guangzhou.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, I went to meetings, for example, with 30, 40 people, and everyone was wearing a mask.
Which is not the case here, of course, but we don't have any. That's part of the problem.
Well, even if we did have them, you would think, for example, that, when the president and his cabinet stand up behind him talking about this, that they might be wearing masks to set an example, or they might have more interpersonal distance between them than they do, but, to set an example, but they don't.
Yeah.
It's very different in China.
Ian, how does this differ from SARS-1?
Well, there are a couple of things that are dramatically different. One is, if you think in terms of how prepared we were for SARS, we didn't have high throughput sequencing. We didn't have the ability, therefore, to rapidly identify this agent. So that's a dramatic difference. It took scientists at the University of British Columbia a week working around the clock. I don't know how many, must have been a dozen people working on that. And now you can solve all this, with a single sequencer, right, in a matter of several hours. So that is dramatically different. And I think, the infrastructure, at least in China, has dramatically changed. We also have more transparency. So the Chinese were, I know people say they weren't transparent. I just don't. I don't think that there was a problem on the national level. I think there may have been some difficulties locally, regionally in Hubei, but I don't think that's the case at the national level. If you're asking about the agent itself, this one is obviously not as pathogenic. So I think the mortality rate is going to be, at least tenfold lower, perhaps dramatic, much, much lower than SARS. But it is far more transmissible than SARS. With SARS, we had, these isolated events where you had super spreaders. But look at the number of places that became where you have infection with SARS. You had obviously Hong Kong, Beijing, Guangzhou, Singapore, Toronto. Didn't really, set up, house in Europe or elsewhere in North America. Whereas this virus, because it is so hardy and so transmissible, is truly global. And, I've lost track of the number of cities where we have it at present. The other thing, of course, the economic impact. The economic impact of SARS was measured in, tens of billions. This is going to be measured in trillions.
How about the disease? Are they similar between the two? SARS
was this acute respiratory distress syndrome, which, for the most part, if you had this, you were extremely ill. This, you've got a much wider spectrum of disease. You've got people who have nothing, who are asymptomatic, and you've got people with mild to moderate disease, which is, well, I didn't think I had moderate disease. Many people thought I should have gone in the hospital, but I felt that I was more comfortable in trying to manage it at home with the physician support that I received. It's a broader spectrum, I think, of disease.
We should say, of course, that you are a physician, so you're capable of taking care of yourself, right?
Well, you might get some difference of opinion on that point, but that's the fantasy that I tried to project, yes. When I didn't want to go into the hospital. But, we have the other thing, of course, is that I have done so much of this kind of work. This is my whole career has been this sort of work. So I don't do an enormous amount of work running field hospitals or things of that nature like some of my colleagues do. But I have experience with going into these sorts of environments and operating safely. Mm-hmm. And as I said, it's ironic that, I get sick in my hometown.
Just a couple more questions, Ian. I don't want to take you too much longer. I could actually hear you wheezing at one point. It's quite interesting.
I'm glad to be amusing.
No, not amusing.
I want to talk about drugs, though, because I think that's important.
Yes.
And vaccines.
Okay, let's do that.
Now, whenever you want to go into that, let me know. But let's start with your questions first.
Yeah, I was going to just ask you whether you thought any antivirals would have an impact on this current outbreak. Well,
there are two aspects to that question. Do I think they're going to be good antivirals for this? Yes, I do. And some of them are already in use and remain to be proven or not. And some are, coming down the pike. We're trying to be helpful as we can. And as you know, we don't work on antivirals, but because we have the virus growing, we're in a position to be able to provide facilities for people who do want to test. I'm not trying to open up floodgates here, but what I'm trying to say is, and we don't insist on publications or anything like that from that, except that you cite, the assistance that you get so that we can use that to maintain the work. But if we can be helpful, we will. There are a whole series of antivirals that are being developed not only by academicians, but also by drug companies that I think are proven to be very useful. And then there's some of these drugs that are being repurposed. The one that I took, the hydroxychloroquine, with or without, azathioprine, is a combination, as you mentioned earlier, that's been promoted by DDA out of Marseille. Mm-hmm. I think until we have, an appropriate blinded trial, we're just not going to know. And I appreciate the concern that some people say that, you cannot do this ethically. But I think you have to do it. Otherwise, you're never going to know. And maybe there's a way to randomize it so that you get one thing or another, and we can see whether or not there's a difference, and you can minimize the number of people in the control arm. But I don't know whether or not I had a response to, to the drug.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's one example. The other thing is plasma therapy, which is a very old approach. Von Behring got the Nobel Prize for discovering diphtheria antitoxin, which was basically convalescent plasma. Mm-hmm. And convalescent plasma has been used for treatment of, Hunin and other South American, hemorrhagic fevers.
Lassa,
so, there are some evidence that this can be useful. The question is when and how. So before the virus clearly, takes hold, and is already sitting inside of cells and can now spread through cell-to-cell fusion, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than having to have an extracellular phase, it's probably going to be more effective. There have been concerns raised about, whether or not, antibodies are going to give you ADE, antibody-dependent enhancement. There's no evidence for that in China, and Zhenju's paper didn't find anything like that. There's another group in China that hasn't found anything of that sort. So I'm not particularly concerned about that. I am concerned to some extent about whether or not you may have, an increase in cytokine expression that could be toxic. But you can approach that by using antibodies directed against, pivotal cytokines like IL-6, and that's what the Chinese do. So, it's going to be important for us to explore all these things in a rigorous way. We have 4 trials that are set up with the FDA at present. One of them is focused on people with moderate disease who are in the hospital already. And then there are 3 others that are more prophylactic in focus. One is with healthcare workers. Another is focused on close contacts who are or are not RNA positive, in nasopharyngeal swabs. And as soon as we receive approval on this IND, we're going to go forward with that. I've been pushing very hard on media, both left and right, to get support for this, and speaking with people, very high levels of government to push this forward, because I think that it's worth exploring. Arturo Casadevall and his colleagues at Hopkins, and there's another group at Mayo as well, have developed some very well constructed protocols. We are trying to use those, unapologetically plagiarizing with their permission, with the idea being that, when everybody does whatever it is they do, if they're sufficiently similar in the structure and design, we're going to be able to do meta-analyses that'll get us to answers more quickly. Arturo has been a leader in this field for a very, very long time, and I'm eager to support him. So we're doing at least 4 of these studies now. We're also doing a double-blinded trial of hydroxychloroquine in close contacts. So we're doing a lot of work of that sort, and we're trying to support people who want to study ways in which masks can be reused. So you've got shortages of masks, and the question is how to reuse them safely, right? So we know that the virus can live on certain types of surfaces for 24 hours and others for up to 72. And we're thinking based really on analogy to treatment of other viruses, that just cooking them at 56 degrees centigrade for 30 minutes might be sufficient. So Thomas Breeze is going to be doing those experiments and testing for virus, viability with, traditional sorts of, assays. Mm-hmm. And then we're doing some work with a radiation biologist who's trying to find ways to sterilize surfaces using ultraviolet light. But we're not using surrogates for any of this work. I don't believe that we should. I think we should do it with the bona fide virus, because I'd hate to get this wrong, because as I say, it is so hardy. And I would not want to be responsible for an outbreak.
Yeah, all good stuff, and I hope sometime in the future when it's all done, we can talk about it again. What about vaccines? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's the vaccine that the Chinese are using. They've started working with is a kill virus vaccine, and I talked with Chen Zhu about this a few days ago. I think he was the third person to receive the vaccine. Because, as director of the Red Cross in China now, for those of you who don't know Chen Zhu is he's a hematologist, oncologist, who's now really become an infectious disease person, because that's what's necessary. And he was Minister of Health for several years, extended his tour there, and then more recently became director of the Red Cross. And he's a real humanist, so he's been sending people and reagents and supplies and things like PPE to Italy and to Spain. Good, very, very good person. Anyway, he was vaccinated himself, and so they're already they're well into their phase 1. Mm-hmm. And as you know, the phase 1 trials began with the NIH vaccine in Seattle, I guess about the same time. What people don't understand, and particularly our leadership, is the process of qualifying a vaccine. It's easy actually for many infectious agents, and I don't think this one is going to be any different, to make a vaccine, whether you want to make a virus pseudotype or some other vectored vaccine or an RNA-based vaccine. It's not going to be difficult. The issue is the phase 1 trial, which is maybe less than 100 people, takes a while to do. Then you have to do the phase 2, which is the efficacy one. The first one is safety. The second is efficacy. And because we can't deliberately infect people, we have to do opportunistic experiments where you go into an area where you anticipate seeing a lot of infection, and then you look for a reduction as a function of having received the vaccine or not. And then you have the third phase, which takes, which requires, thousands of people, where you're testing both safety and efficacy. And, so by the time you're done getting through all those different wickets and producing and distributing it, you're up to 16 to 18 months, which is precisely what, Tony Fauci is telling everybody. Mm-hmm. It's just not something that they want to hear. They'd like to believe that, this is something we can fast track. And we can't. Now, the other concern I have about the killed virus vaccine, is that we may not get the appropriate cell-mediated responses. Mm-hmm. And if all we have is an antibody response, we may see, we may not get viral clearance at all.
Yeah.
Right. So it's, I realize that's sort of counter to what I'm saying about giving plasma therapy, but, there's a lot that we don't know, and that's part of science.
There are quite a few vaccine candidates in various stages, and I suppose some of them may be better than others at inducing cellular responses.
I think so, and I think we're probably going to need both. So,
yeah.
I mean, if I had to pick one, I'd probably be the most eager to look at an RNA-based vaccine. I think those are it's very powerful new technology.
Yeah. Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see how that Moderna trial works out, because it's a nice technology, rapid turnaround, and you could deploy it quickly. So it would be nice if it worked.
Yeah, well, the other thing is we need to develop better correlates for protection.
Sure.
So that perhaps we can obviate some of these steps. I don't know that we'll ever do it entirely, but
yeah.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if 10 years from now people are going to look back at us and consider us quite primitive.
That's the way science works, right?
Yes, sadly so.
So, Ian, given the current state of restrictions here in the U.S., what's a good end game for this? What are we looking at? Do we have any sense? Is it a month, 2 months, 4 months?
You see, it's all contingent upon the way we respond at the national level, in my view. So, I look at, best case scenarios and worst case scenarios. I think the best case scenario, if we were to do everything that, is being recommended by Fauci, and Burkle, right? We could probably be out of this in 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that there wouldn't be isolated pockets of problem, but I think we could really be looking at light at the end of the tunnel. If, on the other hand, we say, we've got everything under control, then this is going to be a much longer slog, and we're also going to lose a lot more people. So, I'm just hoping that, Neil Ferguson's predictions, which are dire, don't come to pass. Mm-hmm. But I think his predictions are well reasoned, and my hope is that people look at them and it gives them pause. The point he was trying to make, of course, is that this is where things could go, but everybody wants those sorts of predictions to be wrong. I'm happy to be wrong. And when I say that, half the world's population is going to become infected this year, nothing would make me happier than to see that, turned around. I'm very concerned about what's going to happen in certain populations where, access to resources is limited. So if you look at, dense populations in Africa, where you have people who are malnourished. You look at the mega cities that are on borders, refugee camps, homeless shelters. These are the people who are very, very high risk, and these are the people who are frequently lost. And they have problems with tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS and hepatitis C, and you name it, right? So this is not reflect well on us, I think, as a culture, if we don't keep care of these people.
What would your advice be to listeners who, and we have a lot more new listeners lately, what would you tell people who are worried and want to be told what they should be doing to protect themselves?
The most important thing you can do to protect yourself at present is to make the assumption that you have this disease and that everybody with whom you come in contact has this disease. So how does that translate practically? Don't shake hands with anybody. Don't kiss them on the other cheek. Be aware that the virus can lurk on all kinds of surfaces. Tables, television remotes, phones, banisters. When I traveled, even before I became ill, I wore gloves every time I was, outside. And I took them off when I came inside. And until I started doing these sorts of media events where I lost control of some of that, because there was just no other way for me to go on air, I was actually doing quite well. The other thing is that, you need to wash your hands frequently. Avoid touching your face, except after you've washed your hands. And if you do go out in public and you have access to a mask, then wear it. And if you don't have access to a mask, then you can use a muffler, a scarf, whatever you like. Anything that is going to keep you from inoculating yourself. The virus, to the best of our knowledge, is not airborne. So that means that it is not suspended in the air. It's a droplet transmission. What that means that, if you're 6 feet away from somebody, you're not going to get sprayed in some fashion that's going to transmit the virus. But again, a lot of this is going to be common sense. Just think about everybody with whom you come into contact is infected, so that you need to protect yourselves from them, and think of the same thing in terms of yourself, in terms of protecting others. This virus is going to become endemic, which means that it's not going away. Even if it abates over the summer, as I anticipate that it will, I expect that it's going to be back in the fall. And until such time as you've been vaccinated or you've been infected and have become immune, you're going to be infectable. We don't understand yet much about whether or not an infection gives you persistent or durable immunity. There's one study with a couple of monkeys, literally 2 rhesus macaques, where we have some data that suggests that immunity, at least in the short term, is real. That if you've been infected, you can't be reinfected, at least in the first couple of months. But we don't know how long that lasts. And until we do, we don't really have any good way to advise you. So those would be the things that I would say from a practical vantage point are the most helpful. If you go onto the website that Vincent's going to share with you, where the actors from Contagion tell you a little bit more about how you can protect yourself and protect the remainder of your friends, family, and the rest of the world, I think you find that they do a better job of explaining it than I can. You'll also get a chance to see these guys without extensive makeup, which is also interesting, make you feel better about yourself. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, because it's very, very important, is that this is not the last threat we're going to face. Nationally, internationally, The international health regulations in 2005 that every single nation state of the United Nations signed said that everyone had to have the ability to diagnose infectious diseases and other threats within their borders, and that they should be transparent about what they learn and what they know. And we put together a program called Gideon, the Global Infectious Disease Epidemiology Network, that comprises departments of health across many areas where we think there's large risk. So Fiocruz in Brazil, and which is D'Souza and Morel, and Liberia, and Mali, and Indonesia, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and China, a number of other groups. I think we had something like 13 nations in total. And if I forget somebody, as I'm sure I have, it's not deliberate, but I'm not entirely well. So please forgive me on this point. This is something that I'm trying to get support from philanthropy to do, because I think that it provides infrastructure in the developing world, and it ensures that everybody employs a common database and uploads their data so that everybody can see it. The WHO, the individual ministries of health, it protects from biopiracy, because everyone, when they post, has protection of their intellectual property, to the extent that they care about that. This could, in fact, have allowed us to pick this up more rapidly, because as people use the tools like DIRCAPseq to identify this agent, in the latter weeks of December, first of all, they would have found it more rapidly, and secondly, it would have been immediately uploaded onto a database where people would have said, pneumonia, Wuhan, I wonder what it is. And they could have zeroed in and seen exactly what it was. And that would have made us a much safer community. So that's really where we need to go. We need to share data. We need to share reagent supplies if we're going to make this world a safer place.
Ian, at any time in your illness, were you ever frightened about your prognosis?
I was. About 3 days ago, I got short of breath. Very short of breath. It was it was early hours in the morning. And, I have a sort of an underlying heart condition, which has complicated things. But there wasn't much I could do about it. So I'm just grateful that I came through.
I am too, personally, and many of us are, and I'm really grateful for your hour chatting with me. I want to wish you a rapid recovery, and I want to thank you for joining me. Ian Lipkin, John Snow Professor, Director, Center for Infection and Immunity at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. Thanks, Ian.
My pleasure.
That's a special episode of TWiV. You can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiV. If you like what we do, consider supporting us, microbe.tv/contribute, and send your questions and comments to twiv@microbe.tv. I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.blog. I'd like to thank ASV and ASM for their support of TWiV, and Ronald Jenkins for the music. This episode of TWiV was recorded, edited, and posted by me, Vincent Racaniello. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.